Hello, this is Angelique with the Gaston County Public Library, and you are listening to the Book to the Library podcast, the audio recordings of the Book to the Library Author Talks. On May 9th, 2019, author Kristy Woodson Harvey visited the library to discuss her book, The Southern Side of Paradise, and her journey as an author.
Thank y'all so much for being here. I am so grateful to be here with you today. And thank you, D'Andrea, for that great introduction and for organizing this wonderful series. I am a big fan of libraries, as you can probably imagine. This is my mom right here. And she took me to the library almost every week when I was growing up. And in fact, we passed some kids when we were coming in, and they were all just loaded down with books. And she was like, "That was you, that was you." But I remember being little and, you're sort of in a world of no, or you can only have one, or after dinner, or, no more cookies. And when you went to the library, you just had freedom. You could just have whatever you wanted and take it home and be in all these new worlds. And it was so much fun. So it's always a treat for me to get to be in a library, and always brings back good memories. I cannot believe that, as D'Andrea was just saying, that my 5th novel just released into the world on Tuesday, because honestly, truly, even 6 years ago, I never thought that I would even have one novel published. So this was all sort of a very welcome surprise. And even 2 years ago, I was at sort of a different place in my career. My 2nd novel, Lies and Other Acts of Love, had just released into the world. And I was out on book tour, much like I am now, for a few weeks, going around the country and meeting readers, which is one of my very most favorite things to do. And I was really savoring that experience, because the sort of unfortunate thing about being an author is that you never really have tenure. You're sort of under contract for a book, or maybe 2 books, or maybe even 3 books, but then you're kind of starting over again every time. So you're always a little bit nervous. So I was a little bit nervous because I was very new to this career, and I thought, I may never get to do this again. So I need to really take advantage of it. So one morning I was in Salisbury, North Carolina, close to here, which is my hometown, and I was getting ready to do my signing there, and I was checking my email really quickly before I walked in, and I had an email from a woman's name that I recognized because she was an editor that I really, really wanted to write for. She had become well known early on in her career for discovering a little book that you might have heard of called Sex and the City. So I was very excited to see her name pop up in my email, and I opened it really quickly, and it started out well. She said, "Dear Kristy, I loved your latest manuscript, but," that's never good. She said, "I don't think it's the right next step for your career, and I want you to call me tomorrow and talk, and I want to talk to you about the idea of writing a series for me." And I was like, oh my goodness, because I had never thought about writing a series. I had never even imagined at that point in my career that someone would want to contract me for a series. So I call my agent, and he says, "That's great, call her, find out what she wants from you, but whatever you do, don't pitch her the idea for the series." And I'm like, I don't even have an idea for a series. And the thing about being on a book tour, which you can probably imagine when you're in, 40 cities in as many days, and you're just trying to make sure that you're in the right place and you have clean clothes to wear and you're not thinking about any brilliant new book idea. So I call her the next morning, and we start chatting, and it goes really well. She's from Florida, which is arguably the South, depending on who you ask around here. Like, I've got some no's going on back here. I was in Orlando last week, and one of the ladies is like, "I'm from Orlando, and I'll just tell you, if you want to go south, you got to go north." And I was like, I'm going to use that. That's clever. But we hit it off right away, and I think I'm going to wrap it up and tell her that I'm going to write her a book proposal when I get home. And before I can, she says, "I love the way that you write about sisters." And I say, "That is so great. I really want to write a series about sisters." And that's not much to say, that could have been anything. And so she says something really dangerous for an author. She says, "Well, tell me a little bit more about that." And my head is going, stop talking, stop talking, stop talking. And my mouth, just out of nowhere, says, "I want to write a series about these 3 grown sisters who all come back home to live with their mother." And she says, "Well, that sounds like chaos. That's a good start for Southern fiction." And she says, "Tell me more about the mother." Well, now I'm realizing what I have done. That the one thing I was not supposed to do was pitch the idea for the series, and now here I am. So my heart is sort of starting to pitter-pat. So my mom and I write an interior design blog that I'm going to tell you a little bit more about in a minute. But fortunately, I had been doing that morning, so that was kind of on my brain. And I'm like, she's a decorator. And I'm kind of going through my mind really quickly all these things that I need to have for a book. And so I'm thinking it's Southern fiction. We've got to have a secret. We've got to have a love story. So I say at the same time that all these girls come back, this man from the mother's past comes back also, and he is carrying with him a big secret. Fortunately, she doesn't ask what the secret is because at that point, I have no idea. So I think this went really well. We get off the phone, and I am furiously scrambling down notes because I can't remember what I've just said. And I mean, I have gone into detail about these girls and what they're like and what their characters are like. And it was like once I got going, I just couldn't stop. So I call my agent, and he doesn't say hello. He says, "You pitched her the idea for the series, didn't you?" I was like, "I did. I just got this idea, and it just came to me." So a few days later, I was in Litchfield Beach, South Carolina. I'll always remember that event. And a woman came up to me after, and I was signing her book, and she said, "I'm so glad that I got to hear your story today because I feel like it's going to change so much over the next few years." And I remember thinking, well, I hope my story changes because if not, you are never going to see me again. And I left that day, and I was pumping gas at the BP station on the side of the highway in Litchfield Beach, and my agent called me, and he said, "I don't know what you said on that phone call, but I might have been wrong because I actually just got you a series deal from Simon & Schuster." And I was like, what? Because I was not expecting that to happen. And I remember thinking about that woman who had been a total stranger and thinking like, wow, she was right. My story just changed right now. And then I looked around and I thought, I wish it was somewhere a little more glamorous than the BP station on the side of the highway, but we take these moments where we can get them. So now every year when I'm doing that same luncheon in Litchfield, I go by and I'm like, there's my BP station. I go in, I'm so excited, and they're probably like, what is wrong with her? But it was a very good memory. And it was a very fitting beginning to this series because these women all come back together during a time when their lives are really changing and they need to kind of come back together to get back on their feet. And together they really are able to do that. And this little town of Peachtree Bluff, Georgia also really helps them along their way. And Peachtree Bluff, I will just have to say, is semi-based on my town of Beaufort, North Carolina, which was kind of fun, but it was also nice to fictionalize it. But now that we're at the end of the series in the Southern Side of Paradise in book 3, I've been thinking a lot about, what this series is about and what kind of the overarching message is. And I think for me, it's that life is almost always different than what we think it's going to be. It never turns out quite like we've planned, but that doesn't mean that it can't be really great. And I'm kind of a good example of that because growing up, I wanted to be a doctor, which is probably as different as you could be from what I'm doing right now, but that's okay because it's good. But I was good at science in school, and people would say, "Oh, you're good at science, you should be a doctor." And I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I was like, okay, yeah, sure, why not? That sounds good. So my senior year of high school, I got an internship at the Salisbury Post, which is kind of nearby. And I loved it. It was a great internship. But I went in on my first day, and I thought I would be making coffee and copies and your general intern type things. And a photographer came over to my little cubicle and told me that he had a story for me. And I was so excited because I was picturing like this grand event that I was going to get to go cover and what this was going to be. And I was going to have a real byline and a real newspaper. And he says, "You're going to go cover a giant squash that looks like Elvis Presley." And I was like, oh, no, that's not good. And I remember thinking, like, how does one write about such a thing? But I went out, and he took pictures, and I interviewed the family and wrote about this big squash. And I must have done a really great job. I don't think it was that none of the actual reporters at the Salisbury Post wanted to write the Garden Game series that year, but they assigned the intern the Garden Game series. So I spent the year writing about 12-foot tall sunflowers and just all sorts of crazy and interesting things. But I realized really quickly that I wasn't just writing about fruits and vegetables. I was writing about these people, and I was writing about their families, and I was telling their stories. And most of these people had never really gotten to tell their story to anyone. And when they were in the newspaper, that meant something to them, and that meant something to me. So much so that it sort of ended up changing the course of my life. So we were sitting around our family dinner table one night, like we did every night, and I said, "Mom, Dad, I have decided that I'm not going to major in biology. I'm going to major in journalism." And Mom said, "Well, that sounds like a great idea. I think you'll really like that." And my dad said, "Have you lost your mind?" And it was a good question because newspapers were shutting down and magazines were closing, and the internet hadn't really hit its stride yet in terms of being able to write and make a living and, those things which are kind of important. But I was undeterred, and so I went to journalism school, and I absolutely loved it. It was a wonderful 4 years for me, and I loved it so much so that I actually decided to kind of keep going with my education. And so I remember going home and telling Mom and Dad that I had decided I was going to get a very practical master's in multicultural and transnational literature. And Mom said again, well, I think that sounds like a good idea. I think you'll really like that. And my dad just sat there for a minute, and he kind of nodded his head, and I thought, he thinks this is a good idea. And he said, so what you're telling me is that you will have gone to 6 years of college and you were qualified for nothing. And I graduated and I got married and I moved with my husband to this little eastern North Carolina town, and I realized that my dad was right. I could not get a job anywhere despite having all of this great education. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to be living my dream. I'm not going to be doing what I want to do. So what am I going to do? So I went to work in finance. It was about the farthest away that I could possibly get, but it was a good job and it was fun and I enjoyed it and I got to travel around, and it was a great experience for me. But I realized as I was traveling around the state and meeting with clients and, talking about their financial needs, that I kept having all of these ideas. And I knew from my creative writing classes in college that they were story ideas. But I also knew that that wasn't what I had wanted to do. I had always told myself I wanted to tell real people's stories. But sometimes, I know there's some writers in the room, and sometimes you have a story that won't let you go. And there was this one that sort of wouldn't let me go. And I thought, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write it. But I sort of had this feeling in the back of my head, like, I think it's a novel, but I can't write a novel. So I don't know what'll happen with this. So I sat down and over the course of, a few months, wrote the first draft of my first novel, which was really exciting for me. And I loved the way that the characters came to life on the page and the way that the story came together. But I didn't think I was, there. So I kept writing and I kept writing and I kept writing. And after a few more manuscripts, I finally thought, I'm going to try to find a literary agent and I'm going to see how that goes. And I was really fortunate to sign with one very quickly. So he was over here trying to sell the manuscript, which I have now learned publishing is a long process. I did not know that. You have to learn a lot of patience, which is not one of my strongest virtues, but I'm getting better. So he was over here trying to sell the manuscript, and I was writing another story. And I had just finished it, and I didn't know anyone in publishing. I didn't really have any writer friends. I didn't really know anyone who had been published. And so I thought, I want some real feedback on this story. So I submitted it to a writing contest just for some feedback, and thought, I'll get some real authors to give me some real advice about my work and see what they think and if I'm on the right track. And I ended up winning that little writing contest. And the final round judge was an editor at Penguin Random House, and she ended up buying my book like a year later, making this sound like a fast story, but it was a slow story. But it was about a year later, but she ended up buying my first book out of a writing contest, which really felt like kind of a magical beginning to this whole story. But suffice it to say, I had no idea what I was doing. I was sort of thrust into this world. I had no one to talk to. I had no one to ask questions to. And I remember he would call me and say things, and I'm thinking I don't even know what that means. And I'd be Googling, what is? And I remember him calling me one day and saying, oh, I have great news. I just sold your first foreign rights. And I didn't even know that was a thing. And he said, yeah, Dear Carolina is going to be translated into Polish. And I said, great. How are they going to translate all those y'alls? And he said, the good thing is you'll never know. So that was true. But around that same time, my mom and I decided that we were going to start a new project. Well, Mom decided we were going to start a new project. She called me one day and she said something that I thought was very strange. She said, I need a new hobby. And she is the busiest person that I know. And I was thinking how would you possibly have time for a new hobby? And she said, well, I was reading this article about how as you get older, you have to learn new skills because your gray matter starts to shrink. And it's very important that, you keep learning new things. So I'm okay. And she says, so we need a new hobby. And I'm okay, there it is. That's where we're going with this. And I say, you know what, Mom? We should start a blog. And she said, perfect. What's a blog? So I explained to her it was a website, and we could write about whatever we wanted. And so we meet in Raleigh, which was the midway point between our two houses at that point. And I taught her how to download a picture and how to send an email. And I thought, I am starting a website with a person that does not know how to write an email. This is my worst idea. You too? Yeah. You're pretty good now. But I thought, this is my worst idea ever. And I've had some bad ones. So, this one's up there. But 9 years later, we are still writing this blog about houses. We were both redoing houses at the time. And we thought, well, we'll write about interiors. And this will be like a fun project that we're going to do for 1 year. And so 9 years later, we're still here. And Mom, who couldn't write an email, can now write HTML code. And so I think your gray matter's intact. So that's the good news. But all of that is to say that this starting something new was part of what lent me my fascination with saving things that are old. And if you've read any of my Peachtree Bluff series, you know that Ansley Murphy, who is the mother and the protagonist of this series, is an interior designer. And her sort of life's work and passion is redoing these historic homes in her little town of Peachtree Bluff. And I had grown up in a historic home, so I knew a little bit about, that process and what that looked like and, the importance of saving things that are good. And so when my husband and I got married, our first 2 houses that we lived in were historic homes that needed to be completely remodeled. And they were very charming, but, the glass was old and the wind blew through at night and all of those lovely things. So we had redone those 2 houses, and we really enjoyed the process. But when we decided to move to Beaufort, we thought, we're going to buy a new house, which is a really ridiculous thing to say when you're moving to the 3rd oldest town in North Carolina. But that's what we decided. We were like, we've done this historical thing. We don't want to do it again. So we went and looked at houses for a few months, and our realtor, I think, finally got the clue that this wasn't going to go that well. And she said, you know what? I have this house downtown that I want to show you. So we go up to this house, and it's sort of, you can already tell, like when you're outside, it's sort of like sagging. And she says, well, it's been on the market for 5 years, and it's been empty for 10. And it's a, historic home in Beaufort. It's actually the new house on the street because it was built in 1903. Every other house on the street is pre-revolutionary. So we walk in the front door, and the smell just kind of like knocks you out very first. And there's green shag carpeting everywhere, and the plaster is all falling down in the ceilings, and in some parts they've like stapled up foam tiles. And my husband steps in, and his foot goes through the floor, like through the floor. So I'm like, well, this is not starting well. So we kind of walk around the house, and we're like horrified that something's gonna, jump out at us. And we get back to the kitchen, and it's this sort of, asymmetrical box, and there are wires running down the walls, and we're like, oh my gosh. So we walk upstairs, and my husband's kind of standing like this, and he says, who would be, because the house is leaning to the right, and he says, who would be crazy enough to buy this place? And I was like, I have no idea. So when we walked away that day, I really never thought that I would go back in that house again, but there was something about it that just kind of wouldn't let me go. So a month later, I found myself secretly back in Beaufort with my father-in-law, who is a retired builder, and his best carpenter and his best electrician. So we're all standing on the sidewalk, like in front of this house, and it's, y'all, like the paint's all scraped off, and the porches are sagging, and the railings are missing pieces. And my father-in-law says, it needs a white picket fence, as though that's going to fix any of the problems. And the carpenter says, it needs a bulldozer. So we go inside, and I tell them to avoid the hole on the floor put there by Will's foot. And so they're running around the house, and they're calling to me like, it needs new electrical, it needs new plumbing. And I'm like, well, yeah, I could have told you that, and I don't know anything about this stuff. So they all come back down, and they're like, we love doing this, but this is a big project. We feel like you should walk away from this one. And I'm like, I know, you're right. And I turned to the realtor and said, I think I'd like to make an offer. And it was a low offer, but as my dad taught me well, when you lowball someone, you should be prepared for them to say yes. And they did. They said yes. So I drove the hour and a half home, and I was so excited. And about the time I got home, I'm like panicking. And my husband and I are sitting in the kitchen, and I'm like, what have we done? And he's like, this was your idea. I don't know what we've done. You're the one that wanted to do this. So we were kind of panicking, and it was funny because whenever there's a beautiful widow's walk on the top of the house, and so whenever the project was just going really, really badly, we would like go up there and be like, oh, the view, the wind, this is why we did this. And people in town were joking that we were up there because we were going to jump because we had bought the house that no one in their right mind would buy. And so I didn't have the idea for this Peachtree Bluff series when we were renovating this house, but I feel like in so many ways it was really writing itself during the process of, this renovation. It was writing itself when that widow's walk I was talking about, the Historical Association and the building inspector had a feud for like 2 years over how to replace it in a way that met both codes. And it was replacing itself when some of our carpentry team came in and they were like, y'all need to get out of the house tonight because we're going to do some things in the middle of the night and you need to have plausible deniability. And we came back the next morning and there was a big window on the third floor that hadn't been there the night before. And it was writing itself with when every little problem ended up turning into a really big problem. And our contractor would say, you know, Kristy, the tide rolls in, the tide rolls out. And it was writing itself in the way that it felt to bring something that was sort of sad and listless back to life, and the way that it sort of seemed to stand up straight and be proud of itself again. And I knew I wanted to write this character that did that not only in her own home, but in the homes of others. My husband said one time that he didn't really feel like our house in Beaufort was ours as much as we were the caretakers of it for the next half century or so, until it was time for the next family to come along and put their mark on it and make it their home. And I feel that way about our stories too. They're never really ours. They're never really meant to be ours, because our stories, like our houses, can only be fully loved and appreciated when they are shared. Which brings me to Southern Charm, which is sort of the crux of this series, and back to the southern side of paradise. Ansley delivers a lot of lines that I really like in this book, but one of them is, I think, maybe my favorite. And I think if this series and that house, and even really just the past 33 years, have taught me anything, it's that we're always being given a chance to start over again. And that's something that these women really learn in this series. So Ansley says at the very end of this book, sometimes life gives you a second chance. And when it does, don't do what I did. Don't drag your feet. Don't give it the opportunity to slip away. Grab it and then hold on for dear life. Thank you so much.
This has been the Book to the Library podcast featuring Kristy Woodson Harvey.